Hello and welcome to Death Expo. This is a special presentation of End of Life University, and I'm so glad you're joining us here today for this interview. I'm your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and my guest today is someone I've been wanting to talk to for a long time, so I'm very excited and very honored to have him here. Today I'll be speaking with Caleb Wilde. Caleb is a sixth-generation funeral director and embalmer in Pennsylvania. He has a graduate degree in Theology, a certificate in Thanatology, and is working on a post-grad degree in the Death, Religion, and Culture program at Winchester University. Caleb is the author of the extremely popular blog Confessions of a Funeral Director, which you can find at Caleb Wilde, with an E on the end of Wilde.com, and I'll give you that URL again later on. And he's been, over the last couple of years, he's been featured on ABC's 2020, on NBC News, and Time Magazine. He's gotten a lot of press, I believe, related to this Confessions of a Funeral Director blog, which has 60-some thousand subscribers, as far as I can tell, on the Internet. And so, Caleb, I'm so delighted that you're here with me today, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm excited to talk with you as well. I'm looking forward to this. So thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Well, I'm curious, and your bio says you're a sixth-generation funeral director, which has to be extremely rare. That means your ancestor back in the beginning probably got started at the very, very beginning of the funeral industry. So your family has been involved in this industry probably from the start. Is that right?
It is. We started out as cabinet makers, which is how most of the older funeral homes in the United States started. We built furniture and coffins as well, which I guess fell under the category of furniture for some odd reason, and we would assist in funerals. And of course, as the industrialization of the furniture industry started, many of us transitioned from furniture making to full-time undertaking, and that happened for us about 150 years ago. So I'm the sixth generation, and kind of what makes me even a little bit more different is that not only is my paternal side a family of funeral directors, but my maternal side is as well. My mom would have been a fourth-generation funeral director had she entered her family's business. So you could say I'm a thoroughbred funeral director.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask, have you always known you wanted to be a funeral director? Was there a time when you considered doing something else?
I didn't want to be a funeral director. When I was growing up, I had around the age of 15, my perspective on life changed dramatically, and I wanted to pursue something that I saw as meaningful, humanitarian work, social work, and I was very intent on becoming something of a missionary or humanitarian aid worker, etc. And I did that for 2 years out of high school, and I was not getting paid for my work. It was based on support from family members and so forth. And I didn't have enough support to continue on, so I ventured back into the funeral industry, which at that time I didn't see as very meaningful. I grew up in a religious family, and I had a number of spiritual leaders advise me not to join the funeral industry because it wasn't meaningful, because it was something where the dead were burying their own dead. So I didn't have much of a positive perspective surrounding both death and funerals. And that perspective has slowly changed as I've been in the funeral industry. I've begun to see the meaning and so forth. But I would say that up until I was licensed, and even a couple of years after I was licensed as a funeral director, it was difficult for me to see value in the funeral industry.
That's so interesting, and yet it does almost seem like it was a destiny for you in a way, with your family legacy on both sides of the family. Yeah,
I tell people I was either destined or damned. It depends on your perspective. So, but you're right. I guess I was kind of bred to be a funeral director. So yeah, I didn't want to be one, though. From about the age of 15, 20 was when I left humanitarian work and started funeral school, and even my pursuit of seminary was because I had anticipated becoming a minister or something that a seminary degree would allow me to do outside of the funeral industry. So I had plans to leave the funeral industry even when I was a part of it. And I've begun to see a side of death, though, and that I'm sure you've seen as well, where there's a lot of life, a lot of beauty, a lot of value, and a lot of meaning. And that's been the impetus that's allowed me to stay.
And what led to you starting your blog, Confessions of a Funeral Director?
When I started it, I was struggling with a number of things. I was struggling with depression on a pretty severe level, and I was also struggling with the industry itself, trying to find meaning. And so writing for me has been an outlet, a way to evaluate things. And so it started out as, I would say, mainly a blog about spirituality, and the confessions aspect was not confessions in the sense where I'm revealing the innermost details of the funeral industry, but it was something related to my spiritual beliefs. So Confessions of a Funeral Director was the idea behind it originally was how death and dying informed my perspectives on spirituality. And so the first year or two, it was mainly articles related to that. And since then it's evolved, but that's how it started.
Did it surprise you how popular the blog became?
It did. I mean, there was small signals throughout the course of the first couple of years. It wasn't that it totally surprised me and caught me off guard. I had a number of different news outlets call, and over time it just seemed to pick up steam and so forth. I think death is a topic that everybody wants to talk about, and it's kind of like sex, but nobody feels comfortable doing it. And so for me, it seems to be that opening up the conversation through my perspective as a funeral director has allowed people to discuss the topic and have conversation about it in a way that they feel comfortable. And I think that's kind of been the one of the main reasons that it's become what it is today.
Because I know, your Facebook page I saw has 68,000 followers, and I think your blog probably has that many too. So it seems like you have really attracted a community of people that need this. They need to hear from you. They need to read what you write. They need to be able to write back to you and share their stories with you. And it seems like you're filling a huge void in our society just by putting putting your blogs out there and your thoughts and your ideas.
Yeah, and like I said, I think people really just want to talk about death. I don't consider, and I'm certainly not an exceptional writer. I'm not the stories that I'm sharing aren't exceptional in any way. I think most funeral directors have similar experiences of the things that I experience as well, and certainly people in hospice care, as you were a part of. And I think it's just getting them out there on social media, and people have gravitated towards it. So I think what it comes down to is people just want to talk about death and dying, and feel as though they have a safe space to do it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense if you're attracting younger readers, or do you know if there's any particular demographic that are following your blog?
Yeah, the demographic is pretty even. It's for the younger viewers, it's about 33%, and then middle-aged and older, 33% in each category. Which most people on Facebook and Twitter and who are reading blogs, I would think, are in the younger category. So I'm kind of surprised that 33% of my readers are over 60, but that's the way it is, and there's 33% are also young. So I think it's a good way to have exposure to different age demographics. And I think that's also part of the draw. Is that there's 60-year-olds on there who have lost parents, lost spouses, and there's also young people like me who still have my parents, and my family's all alive and well, and we're interested in death, but we don't have the same experiences. And I think the balance is a great balance to have, and that's certainly one of the benefits and beauty of social media.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love that idea of the cross-generational conversations that are taking place and the sharing of stories, because I feel like that's so much what we need right now. We need to be bringing people of all ages together to have these conversations.
Yeah, and there's certainly so much to learn from people who have experienced death. For my generation, who, for the most part, I'd say we're death virgins. We haven't lost any significant others. We may have lost parents, but it's like you say, the cross-generational conversation is really important around this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely, and just the opportunity for people of all ages to share their stories and have them read by other people through your website, through the comments section, and I think that's huge that you're providing that platform for people.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good, and that's the best benefit that I've had from it, is being able to read the different stories and being exposed to a lot of the death stories that come across my computer. It's made me into a wholer person, reading different people's struggles and feeling so honored to have them open up. Death is such a vulnerable topic because it's so very personal, and the way that it affects us on a personal level is like nothing else. And to have people who are willing to share these on a public forum without fear of judgment is a beautiful thing, and it's an honorable position for sure.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard much from other funeral directors? Much response or reaction to the things you're writing?
Yeah, and it's pretty divided. I would say that there's people who really appreciate what I'm doing, and then there's a completely different camp that doesn't like what I'm doing at all. So I think the people who don't like what I'm doing don't appreciate the transparency that's involved with social media. They don't appreciate the fact that I'm talking about the funeral industry and ways that we can, do some of these things ourselves and bypass the industry, some of the critique that I've leveled towards the industry. And I can understand, nobody likes to be criticized, and especially when it's on a public forum, and a lot of these funeral directors don't have the ability to respond back. So I certainly understand why they'd be upset. But at the same time, in life, I think you just have to decide that there's some people that you need to offend. And if they are offended by critiques that are in regard to their pricing or in regard to sales tactics, then that's fine with me. And I think, on the other hand, the people that are accepting of what I'm doing, maybe have seen a little bit more and listened to different perspectives and understand that there's not one way to perform a funeral, and the traditional funeral of embalming and burial holds value for some people, but it doesn't hold that value for everybody. And they are willing to adapt to different people's values and different people's wants. And in any business, obviously, and the funeral industry is a business as much as we'd like to say it's a ministry or a nonprofit. But in any business, if you're not listening to what your customers want, and if you're not meeting your needs, you're just not going to succeed.
You mentioned the pricing and sales tactics as being a couple of the things that you dislike about the funeral industry. Are there some other critiques you have that you could share with us?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of them have been covered by the media, for sure. And rightfully so. The funeral industry is based on a large degree of trust, and honor, and whenever that honor and trust is broken by a funeral director, it's rightfully exposed. But there's still things that people just don't understand, and funeral directors aren't doing a very good job in educating. That obviously there's ways to save money. There's ways to spend less on funerals. There's ways for funerals to have more meaning without a funeral director, and these options just aren't being discussed, I believe, for financial reasons. Just some simple things like not all cemeteries require a vault. Now, it's a funeral director's legal requirement to let the family know that, but not all funeral directors do. We're also required to tell families that embalming is not a necessity except in a very few specific circumstances. And that's something as well, that there's just not the transparency that's legally required of us, and even on a more important level, ethically required. So that's something that needs to be talked about. Death is such a difficult topic to discuss, and it's behind so many closed doors that people just aren't prepared when somebody in their family dies. They haven't talked about funerals, and they haven't talked about what they want, and they're in a very vulnerable situation to be exploited by some capitalistic funeral director. And unfortunately, that does happen. And I don't know how often it happens, but it does. And I think that it's just simple educational steps that need to be taken in order for it to not happen. And hopefully, media exposés and maybe even my blog at times will help people educate themselves out of being manipulated.
And I can see how consumers are particularly vulnerable. For one, as you mentioned, being grieving in the grief state at the time when they're
Sure.
trying to make decisions, but also being, in large part, totally uninformed about
Sure.
what the laws do say. And at
Yeah.
least, even for me, my entire education about what happens in a funeral home came from watching 6 Feet Under. That's actually what I base all my knowledge on. I have no idea if that was even a factual show, but
Sure. Yeah. And grief, like you mentioned, grief is almost it's a form of inebriation at first, where you can't think straight, you can't make large decisions, you shouldn't be anyways, and yet you're going to be purchasing a funeral that could range anywhere from a couple thousand to 10 to 20,000, depending where you're going. It's just a dangerous concoction, and it's easily exploitable, unfortunately. And there's funeral directors that like to hide behind an air of professionalism, and those funeral directors need to be exposed. And I think social media is a great way to do so, because if you're willing to put yourself on social media as a funeral director, if you're willing to talk about, converse in a public forum about death and dying and funerals, the likelihood is that you have nothing to hide. And so I'm thankful for Facebook and for blogs and for websites and so forth. I think it's going to do a lot of good in the next 10 to 20 years to weed out the funeral directors that are looking to exploit people in a grief-inebriated state.
Mm-hmm. And Caleb, one of the things I've had a concern about, it seems that there has been a trend in some groups in our society away from even having funerals, and I've been hearing more and more about some families are just having their loved ones cremated and not holding a funeral, and that concerns me just because I've seen a real value behind funerals, but I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, it certainly is happening a lot. We have a storage room of cremated remains that they were direct cremations, no services, and the family hasn't even picked them up. Now, I know there's various reasons why a family doesn't pick up the cremated remains of their loved ones. A lot of it centers around fear and anxiety and so forth. But I think there's a devaluation as a whole in society towards anything that's considered tradition, or we like to deconstruct anything that's seen as sacred. And it seems that, unfortunately, funerals have been categorized as both sacred and tradition, and people just feel as though they're not as necessary as I believe they are.
Mm-hmm. And I can see we have the risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, as we try to get more transparency in the funeral industry. If people are saying, "Oh, we'll forget funerals altogether, then we don't need those at all." But I think you're right, and I'm certainly, and I've been misinterpreted on this on a number of occasions, but I think part of the distinction is that you need a funeral, you don't need a funeral director, and people equate them to be one and the same. There's ways that a family can save money sans a funeral director, but one of the things that I've been throwing around as to why funerals are valuable is relates to storytelling and narratives. I think personal stories, our experience, sharing those experiences are a necessary factor in life. It's not a luxury. It's not for people who are good communicators. It's not for the wealthy. It's a necessary facet in every demographic, in every walk of life, in every country. We need to share our stories. And I feel like the funeral is
that incredibly special time when a person's story can be brought together through others' interpretations, and we can paint a final perspective on the deceased at a funeral. And there's obviously a lot of other reasons that where funerals are important. Funerals have always been a way to honor somebody, and on the other hand, when we seek to dishonor somebody, we deny them funerals. Like Osama bin Laden, some other people were denied. I think Saddam Hussein was denied a funeral. But it certainly speaks of honor. It speaks of story. It speaks of valuing an individual life, and it's something that if we're going to deconstruct the value of a funeral, which I think has already happened, we need to have voices who are going to reconstruct the value. And one of the things that where I can see our generation, my generation, latching onto, and the baby boomers as well, is the narrative vein. Story and storytelling and individual stories resonates with us, and I think that if we're going to reconstruct the value of a funeral, the tradition of a funeral, I think we start there by talking about the necessity of storytelling and story sharing, and the value of a funeral to finalize that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that's beautiful, and I can't agree more when I think about, my own parents' funerals, my uncle's funeral, and just the idea that so many different people come together in that one space to honor the deceased, and their family, friends, co-workers, even sometimes acquaintances that no one else even knows who show up at the funeral,
Yeah.
but everyone has such a different picture of the deceased and a different story to tell, and when you weave them all together, it's a really powerful way to say goodbye.
It is, yeah. It's kind of like a mosaic. You have all these broken shards, and they come together, and you create a beautiful picture, and certainly something that, like I said, I think it's a necessity. It's not a luxury. It's an integral part of what makes us human, and what defines community. And it's certainly something that I think we need voices for, not just the value of funerals, but the value of community. I think it's such a it directly leads into that. How community is something that seems to be becoming more and more fragmented, and what's community going to look like in 20 years with social media and so forth? It's a big discussion, but it's an important one.
But we need these major threads of life, birth and death, to hold us together and to continue to tie us together, and we need to honor them. Yeah, and I think we lose a part of ourselves, for sure. We lose a part of the community, becomes less life-giving as death creeps out of it. As you say, birth and death, these facets, and it's kind of ironic how as death leaves community, so does life. Death is such a life-giving aspect. In fact, what I've seen, and I know you've probably seen it too, there's probably few things that are more life-inspiring for families, for churches, for schools than death. Perhaps there's nothing more life-giving than death. And as death moves out of community, so does life. That's such a good point. And that really informs, I would say, that informs my work, and it obviously does yours as well, too, that we need to keep death in the forefront of our awareness at all times in our community in order to stay healthy, in order to keep growing and evolving.
Yeah. Yeah, I've often said before that, I live in a small town of 4,000, and there's many times where the center of our small town isn't the local public school. It's not the church. We have a couple community centers. It's not the community centers. The center of our community is oftentimes the funeral home, and it's a very important facet of empathy, of seeing different perspectives, and even grasping the value of one another, not just empathy but love. And I think that certainly death and funerals sit at the very core, not the outside of what makes communities work.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to just tell a short story in praise of funeral directors, because in my own family, my father died traumatically of suicide. He shot himself, and it was such a sudden, tragic death, horrible death. There's no way that we could have done anything without the help of a funeral director in terms of making plans, bringing people together, putting an announcement in the paper.
Sure.
We were just all in such shock and so traumatized by it. And I was so grateful for that funeral director, and he actually knew my dad, and
oh, that's great.
He managed to cosmetically repair my dad so that we could have an open casket at his funeral, which didn't seem possible to me, but it turned out to be so incredibly important for the grief process for all of us that we could see him whole one last time.
Yeah.
And then at his funeral, to sit and watch, there were 500 mourners who came, and watch some of these older men, my dad's age, who came to view his body and touched him and connected with him, and to be able to see that was so helpful with our grief as a family, just to be able to see everyone come together and experience it. And so I know that's a tough story to tell, but none of that could have happened without the help of our funeral director. And so it was a role of extreme importance that he played for us.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and it's such a heavy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but I'm so thankful as well that you guys had somebody who was there, had your best interest in mind, and I think that's one of the reasons why I just have such a hard time with corporate funeral homes, the larger funeral homes, is because I believe that one of the roles of the funeral director is not just to be there during the time of death, but to be a part of the community's life, so that when somebody dies, as was the case with your dad, he knew how to, he was already invested in you guys, for one, and so he, I'm sure he went to the extra lengths to make sure your dad looked as good as he could, and he knew what your dad looked like. Those are some things that you just can't quantify, and I'm local funeral directors, guys and women, men and women who invest their time into a local community, I think just have the opportunity to provide an invaluable service, and I think it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I wanted to make sure that we told that story and brought up that praise for funeral directors too, because as much as we're trying to weed out any of the bad actors who might be out there, that it's an extremely valuable and very needed profession in our society, and I want to give honor and credit to those who do that such difficult work for us.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think certainly there are the bad apples, and it's kind of similar to the priesthood in a lot of ways. The couple bad apples can ruin the batch, but for the most part, I think the majority of funeral directors are in the profession to serve others and have at their center, at their core, a desire to help people out. And those guys and girls work extremely hard to do that, and often at the expense of family and friends. I'm sure very similar to a physician or a hospice worker. And certainly love makes us work beyond the requirements of a job, and I think there's a lot of funeral directors who feel that about their communities and about the people they work for.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like in many ways you've made peace with this profession. I mean, you at least being a funeral director, and I'm wondering are there certain benefits for you or ways that you've grown through being a funeral director that make you happy that you're in this profession now?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a number of ways that it's changed me for the better. Death has a way of allowing us to question our lives, to question life, to sort the things that aren't valuable and help us to focus on the things that are. It can create discord and it creates confusion, but the searching for stillness, the searching for silence, the way that it pushes us to the contemplative are all things that I've been super I wouldn't have seen them. I don't think outside of the funeral industry. There's been a lot of tragedy, and I know that I'm sure you've seen it, and anybody who's listening who works in hospice or works at a hospital or maybe even is in the part of the funeral industry, there's things that we see that we can never unsee and that will carry with us the rest of our lives. But then there's also things that we see that are so incredibly profound and beautiful that they change us and make us like them. And I think those are the things that have kept me in it, that I've seen amazingly, and I don't think I would have said this or expected this. I've seen a lot more beautiful than I have ugly surrounding death. And so the funeral industry has allowed me that perspective that I may have gotten had I been working somewhere in humanitarian work. I'm sure I would have seen that, but death has a way of making the contrasts a little bit more and allowing us a slightly clearer perspective on life. And I'm thankful for that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really beautiful and very well stated. And I was going to follow up my story about my dad's suicide, as tragic as it is. That's actually the reason I got into hospice work myself eventually, and so that tragedy led me to the place where my life became infinitely richer and deeper and more informed than I ever would have been if I had continued down the other path I was on. So I think, just as you're saying, death has so much to teach us and so much to offer us.
Sure. Yeah, like the story that you shared on my blog, The Perfect Funeral. What a beautiful story. And I'm assuming, as you stated, this was a part of your hospice colleagues and so forth. Mm-hmm. And taking care of Ralph when he didn't have any community. I think you called it your hospice family. I really do believe that community sits at the core of what we want. Community belonging sits at the very core of what makes us human. And for some reason, it's just designed that the way that community is built is through life and death. And it's an amazing thing that we find things that we've been searching for in some of the darkest places. And that seems to be what happens.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that, as you were saying, with social media nowadays and the Internet has sort of fragmented our society, and it has taken us off in many different directions. And where we have community, many times on the Internet, it seems like somewhat superficial community, except when we bring death into the picture, as you're doing with your blog. And then I've been trying to do that with End of Life University, like using social media but putting death right in the center of it to give people something to gather around, to create a community with a lot more depth and a lot more meaning than a lot of the other things we see on social media.
Yeah, and I think it's certainly possible. I think today's the 1-year anniversary of Robin Williams' death. And it's kind of an odd thing, but you saw so many people's outpouring on social media concerning a figure that none of us had never met. For my generation, somebody had been involved in our childhood in numerous movies and so forth, and even something as seemingly impersonal surrounding the death of a celebrity, social media, the value of social media came through, where we were able to share about a death that impacted a lot of us, and even more so when it comes to something that's personal. There was a fire in our town this morning, and unfortunately the fire contained a handicapped person who perished in the fire. And the details are still forthcoming, but the way that people have come together over social media, there's already been people contacting about giving money, and the amount of good words that have been spoken towards the family through social media, it might be slightly overwhelming for the family, and I'm sure it will be for days and days ahead. But I think when it comes to death, social media finds a way to bring out some of the positives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to just praise you for finding a way to utilize social media in such a positive way of creating that community. But I'm wondering if you could change the funeral industry in the future. Do you have a vision for what it might look like in the future, what you would like to see in your own profession?
Yeah, it's a good question, and my answers might be a little bit complicated, but I think it's kind of similar. I mean, we've all heard the phrase, "We get the president that we deserve," et cetera, either for good or bad. We get the government that we deserve for good or bad, and I think it's the same way with the funeral industry. The funeral industry fits what people want right now. And I'm hoping that what people want will begin to change as we become more familiarized with death, as death becomes less taboo, and as we realize that in some deaths, not all, I think tragic deaths will always need some type of guide to help us through. But in deaths that are anticipated and deaths where a family can come together and practice death care on their own, I think as the taboo surrounding death is talked about, communicated about, and we learn more about it, I think that the future of the funeral industry, and the way that I'd like to see it go, is towards a more home funeral orientation and a green burial orientation. So that's changes that I'd like to see, but the changes that would take place would have to take place outside the funeral home first. and outside the funeral industry. I think for the most part we give people what they want, for the most part, and I think the changing of the funeral industry, the changing of how people approach funerals has to start in the public forum before it starts in the funeral home, and I think we're starting to see that, and I people like you, and there's other people as well who are wanting to start the conversation about death. And the more we're able to talk about it and the more comfortable we feel, the more comfortable we'll feel with our own dead. And I think that's going to be something that changes the funeral industry when we're at that point. And we're not there yet, but hopefully we will be.
And that's a good point to make, because I think the same is true in medicine. As much as we'd love to see medicine change the way care is offered at the end of life, I think that change also is going to come through grassroots movements more than it will come from within medicine, because it's similar, as you were saying, that medicine responds to what people want and what people are demanding and looking for.
That's interesting. I would have thought it was the other. I mean, I see the medical profession probably different lenses than you do, but I would have thought that it wouldn't be as market defined as maybe you're saying it is, or defined by the market.
I'm thinking if we look back at the home birth movement, and natural childbirth, that started as a grassroots movement, and it was kind of opposed by the medical profession and took a lot of push and demands from baby boomers primarily, who got that, who made changes there. So I think that will happen in medicine. I think we're at a shifting place in our society as a whole, where our attitudes are changing about death and dying, and then we're going to be asking for different services from medicine and the funeral industry and all of those here at the end of life. Yeah.
I hope so, and I hope that our voices can all come together and we can be the change. I think we have the real opportunity to do that.
Well, right now in your practice as a funeral director, do you ever assist families with green burials? Are you ever involved in that, or?
I was able to arrange the first prearranged green burial. It's a gentleman who's still living, and he has wanted one for the past, I suppose, 10 years, which he's at the beginning of the bell curve, and so I was able to assist him in that, arranging it and so forth. And he was just super excited to know that there's a green cemetery. It's about 2 hours away from us. I think there's about 100 green cemeteries in the United States. So there's not very many, considering there's, I think, like 40,000 cemeteries or some astronomical number. It's probably even bigger than that. But the green cemetery is about 2 hours away, and we arranged for him to purchase some lots there, and we bought a wicker casket and so forth for him to be buried in. And he's really excited, but there's just not very many people in my area who are interested in green burial and wicker caskets. My hope is within the next 10 years is that I'll be able to have enough funds at my disposal to purchase some land and turn it into a green cemetery. And I've been saying that for quite some time now, and that's a legitimate goal that I have. Once I have that in place, I think it will help people it'll direct people towards that choice.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And I think we need so much more of that, people willing to donate land or purchase land and have it used for that purpose.
Yeah.
I'll be excited to see that happen.
Yeah, hopefully.
And
I'll
then
have
you
to
were also
write a lot more blog posts before that happens.
Yeah. You were also mentioning to me before the interview started that you're creating a new website, and I was hoping you'd tell everyone about that.
Yeah, right now I have the URL name as Death Hub, and because most everything else was taken, it's amazing. These companies come in and they buy all the different names for websites, and there's hardly anything there unless you're willing to pay a couple grand to get the URL that somebody else owns. But it's been something that I've been throwing around for, maybe 3 or 4 years, of starting a website that was basically, in its construct, similar to a Reddit community, where people start their own threads and they interact with each other, and it can be from anywhere from personal death experiences to death facts or the macabre, anything that's at all related to death, funeral questions, dying questions, just a community where people feel the freedom to talk about anything they want about death. And one of the things, as I said, that I've been privileged to see as the moderator, or as being in charge of my blog, is so many people have stories and they want to share their stories, and so many people have questions and they want to get feedback from others. And I'm hoping that this blog can become that, or this website rather, can become that forum where they can feel that freedom. So I feel like I'll be able to use my blog community and direct them towards this community, and hopefully, my blog is my thoughts and my experiences, but it attracts so many people who have similar questions and thoughts about death that I want them to have their own space that's not just being inspired by what I'm writing, but can be inspired by what each other are writing. So that's what I'm hoping to do, and that launches in about a month. And so once it's up and ready to go, I'll start publicizing it and throwing people away from my blog and towards it. So, and I'm sure my blog and this website will be able to coexist, I'm sure, and hopefully feed off each other.
Well, I'm so excited about it because it seems like a sort of a written death cafe in a way, where anyone can come, anyone can share anything that they'd like to talk about. So there's no need for expertise or a lot of knowledge or information. Anyone can write their story, and I think that's fantastic. I think that'll be a really helpful forum to have. Yeah,
hopefully. And as I've learned with different forums online, it seems like these, if a forum becomes popular enough, either on Reddit or somewhere else, a lot of people get directed to those forums, and these online forums that aren't written by experts but are written by anybody, they become a source of knowledge and a source of inspiration for a lot of other people. So hopefully that's what will happen.
Yeah, well, I'm excited about that. So that's something that listeners out there can watch for, Death Hub. And I like the name. I think that's great.
Yeah.
It will be a hub of information.
Yeah. There's so many other names, but they were all taken. So that is what we decided on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be great. And then I want to direct our listeners to your website, which is calebwilde.com, spelled CalebWilde.com, with the E on the end of Wild. Okay. And your Facebook page is under Confessions of a Funeral Director. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. It is. Facebook.com/Confessions of a Funeral Director.
And I've speaking for myself, I've really enjoyed reading your blogs and following the content on your website. So I would encourage other people to check that out as well, and just stay connected with you through social media.
Well, thank you so much for the plug, and thank you for everything that you're doing. And I know your perspective as a hospice worker and as a physician is a very important voice in this discussion. And so I think also it's a voice that's calming because you've had so much experience and you bring such a wealth of knowledge. So I'm very thankful for that.
Well, thank you, Caleb. And I just want to let you know again, I really appreciate your time and that you're sharing with us today. And I want to wish you the best of luck in your work.
Thank you so much.
And to everyone out there who's listening, I want to thank you also for taking the time to listen in. None of these interviews could happen if it weren't for an audience being there who wants to hear this content. So thank you for tuning in again. And until the next time we get together, we'll say goodbye.